Okay, we're going to be talking about illicit sex in colonial America. Illicit in this sense means it's not lawful, it's not legitimate, it's not acceptable forms of sexuality that people engaged in colonial American times. Now, the critical thing to keep in mind is these were all thought of as sinful acts. And sin was something that everybody was prone to, particularly if you are a Puritan. You see human nature as profoundly sinful and then leading to people to commit acts of sin. The only kind of legitimate sex in their mind was sex between marital partners, not necessarily for reproduction, because Puritans believed that sex was an incredibly important part of marriage, part of what bound the husband and wife together. So even if you can't get pregnant, let's say she's already pregnant or it's past menopause or whatever, sex could still be important because it was creating a bond between them. Outside of marriage, however, everything else is illicit, not acceptable kinds of sexual behavior. And then the final thing to keep in mind is they tended to think of this as a matter of acts rather than where we would think of identity. So if a man repeatedly committed sodomy, they would see him as committing a certain type of sin coming from his sinful nature, which we all have or are born in a state of sin. But they would not think of him as a homosexual, partly because the word did not exist, but also because that's not how they thought about it. They didn't think of him having a different identity beyond sinner, even though he had committed acts that we would describe as being homosexual. An essential part of how this all worked was people in the community watched other people in the community. This is particularly true in New England, where it is built in small towns, so people are all close together in their houses. It's less true in the South, in places like the Chesapeake, where people are much more spread out. But regardless, gossip plays an important role. And it was seen as a way to maintain the moral standing of the community. So you read these descriptions of court cases where things happened, and they'll describe the neighbors doing something like Susanna Kennett and John Tully of Virginia did. They heard snoring in the next room, so they stood on a hogshead of tobacco. So they climb up on this big barrel and peer over the wall. And then when they saw that Richard Jones was lay snoring in her placket, and Mary West had put her hand in his codpiece. And then they actually pried loose a board to get a better view. And they noticed that Mary West had her coat up around her middle, and Richard Jones was lying down upon her in his breeches. So you get the idea. It's seen as a moral action to see what's going on about your neighbors, to report on that, to spread that information. And gossip was so potent and important that people made lawsuits over it. That they were being accused of things that they claimed they were not guilty of. They would actually have lawsuits over gossip. And of course, the other thing is that what is gossip today can be court testimony tomorrow. So like those earlier people I was talking on who were spying on their neighbors, we know they were spying on their neighbors because they ended up reporting on it in a fornication case in court. Particularly targeted and believed to be sexually problematic were what they called wenches. And remember, women are thought of as being the lustier sex, the more sexual gender, and that they have a much harder time controlling their sexuality. And so what they are looked at is particularly for non-elite women. So the idea is elite women, they're being controlled by their husbands and stuff, but particularly non-elite women are looked as not having their sexuality necessarily under control, particularly servants, particularly enslaved women. And there's this stereotype of them as being promiscuous and sexually available. And this becomes a particularly strong stereotype that is applied to enslaved women and black women in general, is this idea that they are automatically sexually promiscuous, automatically sexually available, that's built into their nature. And the term that was often used to refer to them was wenches. So the first sort of big sin is fornication. And that's two people who are not married having sex. The thing is, a lot of times we know about fornication, and they knew about fornication, sometimes because of spying, like we heard about earlier, but a lot of times because of pregnancy, which made it very visible, but it also brought up the question of who is going to support the child. If it's a married couple, obviously the father's supposed to support the child. Well, what's going to happen if they're not married? It sort of can go in a couple of ways. Sometimes people who are accused of fornication are people who are actually courting, possibly engaged. For a lot of common people, that was acceptable. Once you got engaged, sex was okay. And there actually was the practice of bundling, courting couples sleeping in the same bed with maybe a board between them or something to prevent them from consummating their relationship. And then, of course, in terms of getting actually married, non-elite common people, what they generally did is they set up housekeeping together. They didn't bother going through a formal legal ceremony necessarily, particularly because in a lot of areas, like on the frontier, you don't necessarily have a minister handy. There was a shortage of them. So you could do something that in your community, among your people, was seen as perfectly reasonable. And then the elite could look at you and say, you committed fornication. And so in terms of premarital pregnancy, sometimes the people who are being attacked for it don't consider themselves guilty at all. They think they're doing the right thing. Then there is also non-marital pregnancy. So whereas before those were people who were in the process of marrying, process of courtship, there are women who get pregnant as a result of seduction, rape. Part of the problem is the medical belief at the time was that a woman could only get pregnant if she had an orgasm, along with a male orgasm. So pretty much by definition, if she's pregnant, it wasn't rape. They would generally force the mother to confess the name of the person who got her pregnant by questioning her while she's giving birth. Because the idea is when a woman is giving birth, she's facing the possibility of death. She's being confronted with her destiny. And so at that point, the belief was she would be much more likely to tell the truth. So that's when they would question her to try to find out who was the man who had impregnated her. Infanticide. Some women, perhaps driven by shame, committed infanticide. And because of that, it becomes a crime to conceal the birth of a bastard child, a child of unmarried parents. And if you gave birth to a stillborn child and you're not married, that could create an assumption that you were responsible for that child's death. So it becomes a possible assumption for women who are unmarried that they may engage in infanticide. When it comes to a matter of actually having it go to court and have a court decision, Black servants and Black enslaved women were the most likely to be convicted of infanticide. So who you are played an important role of what happened to you if you were considered to be guilty of this. And that becomes a sort of broader pattern where historically enslavers frequently accused enslaved women of engaging in abortion, engaging in infanticide, being bad, careless mothers, sort of ways of justifying the fact that a lot of black infants did die because of a series of environmental reasons, overwork, a whole bunch of stuff. But the blame is always placed on the mothers themselves. So you go to court to be judged for crimes such as fornication. Men had a real advantage, particularly if you were a man of higher status. You could deny paternity. She's lying. She's not telling the truth. Or say that, well, she's just promiscuous. She slept with so many men. We can't tell who's that. Women were, on the other hand, much more likely to be punished, and when they were punished, they received harsher penalties. Sometimes it's public shaming. That could mean having to stand up in front of the church and have a sermon basically preached at you. It could mean being put in the stocks at the center of town. It could mean being forced to pay a fine. That's particularly true for men. It could mean a public whipping. In some cases, if the family is of appropriate social class, the family of the girl could force the man into marriage, pressure them into marriage. If you've got a real social gap, if the man is of higher standing, that's much harder to do. Well, let's say that as a result of fornication, there is a child born, a bastard child born. What they try to do is force the father to pay for it. And once again, if you're of lower status, it was easier for them to convict you of this. What happens to the babies is they are usually bound out for a number of years to pay for their raising. So somebody takes in the child, paying a fee for them, and in exchange for that, the child, once it becomes able to work, they will work for you for a number of years. If you are a woman and you are an indentured servant, getting pregnant means that you're going to have extra years added onto your contract because it's believed that you're not as good of a servant during the time where you're pregnant. You can't get as much work done. So you need to be punished by having extra years added on. Interracial relationships. If you look at the very beginning, the first few years of colonization, the rules were basically the same for people of all races. If you were a servant or a slave of color and you engaged in fornication, you're going to get whipped and fined just like a white servant is going to get whipped or fined. And interracial marriage was legal. That begins to change over time, so it sort of evolves into a situation where the sentences became longer if you are a man of color. So, for example, a black man might be sold into slavery to compensate the owner of the woman he got pregnant. You have additional sort of penalties. So usually a child, when they're bound out to be cared for, a bastard child, that's until they become an adult. In the case of mulatto children, children of mixed race, they get bound for 30 years, a significantly longer time period, well into adulthood, is their penalty for being a bastard child, basically. So there's sort of this intermediate period, and then 1662, Virginia makes the first law that says slavery is perpetual and slavery is inherited through the mother. If your mother is a slave, you are going to be enslaved. If your mother is free, you are free. Other colonies follow this legal pattern. 1691, they passed another law in Virginia. English or other white women were now prohibited from marrying or fornicating with Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians to avoid the abominable mixture and spurious issue of these unions. And so you have interracial marriage and interracial sexual relationships becoming illegal for white women and black men. None of these laws, and they're never going to, are actually designed to cover white men and black women, Indian women. So in 1692, Maryland mandates 7 years of service for a woman who bears a mixed-race child, a white woman who bears a mixed-race child. Series of laws continue. They spread through the colonies. The interesting thing is that despite these laws and despite these barriers, interracial relationships continue, a lot of which is rape and forced sex of black women by white men. But also you do have relationships that appear to be consensual across the color line that continue to exist in society, despite the laws and rules against it. Adultery, having sex when you're married to someone else. 1631, Massachusetts had enacted the death penalty for adultery. Most colonies followed suit, but they actually rarely enforced it. Usually in New England, what would happen is you had a fine of 10 to 20 pounds, public whipping, or wearing of the letters AD on a garment, or having those letters burned into your forehead. Southern courts tended to whip people guilty of adultery, sometimes use the threat of banishment. They also might require a financial bond of up to 100 pounds sterling that you would forfeit if you started seeing each other again. A lot of times adultery led to divorce, and this is usually adultery committed by the woman. It's much harder for a woman to get a divorce based on adultery than it is for a man. About 50% of the New England 17th century divorce cases were based on adultery. Sodomy. First of all, what is sodomy? That varies depending on the time, place, and the laws involved. It's frequently used to describe penetrative sex between men. It sometimes specifically refers to anal penetration. And it was generally illegal. Sex between women, in most cases, was not against the law because probably it's a much vaguer concept. How do you have sex, real sex, without a penis is sort of the way that people thought about it at that time. So it was much less considered as an issue in society. Sodomy is clearly a sinful act. It's a crime. But it did also exist. There's this interesting story of 17th century Windsor, Connecticut. A man, Nicholas Sension, who was basically a local big deal. He was a very wealthy man. And over a period of about 30 years, he sexually harassed and tried to initiate sex with a half dozen young men. And these were usually young men of lower status, servants and people like that. They complained about it, but it was generally ignored, probably due to his wealth and status. Senshin finally messes up because when his former servant goes around saying, hey, this is what he tried to do to me, he sues him for slander. And the court at that point says, well, that's a step too far. We all know you're guilty of this. And so they actually charge him with sodomy or attempting to commit sodomy. And the jury sentenced him to stand under the town's gallows with a rope around his neck, that he was whipped, and that he had to pay fines to cover court costs and ensure future good behavior. He also forfeited his rights as a free man. So a lot probably depended on your status, whether or not you could get away with it. Now, it's important to keep in mind these are sinful acts. You're not accusing somebody of being a homosexual. You're accusing them of committing sodomy, doing something specific. It's an act, not an identity. Theoretically, sodomy was in most cases a capital crime, something that warranted execution, but that very seldom happened in practice. The men who were sentenced to death for committing sodomy usually had used force to assault their victims. So rather than it being consenting intercourse, it was rape, essentially, sexual assault. And those were the men who were likely to be executed for it. Rape in general was thought of as something that happened to women. It theoretically carried the death penalty if the woman was married, engaged, under 10 years old. In other words, if she was someone else's property. It's very hard to prove rape. You have to have witnesses that can testify that they literally saw the victim resisting by calling out for help to try to stop what was going on. So if you don't have those witnesses, you have no chance. And it could be very hard even with those witnesses, particularly if it's a higher status man. They were much more unlikely to be brought to trial for rape. Lower status men who were brought to trial for rape generally received harsher treatment. If you were not white, you were much more likely to be actually executed for rape. So, for example, in New York, a free black man who was convicted of 2 attempted rapes of white women was burned alive. There's other cases in other areas. In several colonies, the laws prescribed castration for black men who attempted to rape white women. So, rape did exist as a concept, hard to prove, but it's really entangled in the status system as well, in terms of who can get away with it and what kind of penalties they might have to pay. So sort of the things I want you to keep in mind when you think about this is, first of all, remember when we're talking about the colonial era, women are the lusty sex, particularly if they're of low status, in servitude, enslaved, or of color. But women are the one with the out-of-control sexual desires, not men. Your wealth, your social status, and your race shaped the penalties and convictions that happened for sinful acts. And then the final thing to keep in mind is we're talking about sinful acts, not sexual identities. And you sinful human beings commit sodomy, but they're not homosexuals. They're simply people who engage in sinful acts.